Hello there, it's Mr. Logue. Today's lesson is finding percentages of quantities, and quantities in this lesson just means a number, like this number. This calculation is asking us to find 51% of 900, and in actual fact this calculation was on the 2019 SATS practice arithmetic paper. The method we're going to practice in this lesson is finding key percentages. This is a great method to practice so that you can calculate percentages of quantities and numbers mentally. 50% of a number, that is the same as dividing by something. 50% of a number is the same as dividing that number by 2. Finding 25% of a number is the same as dividing that number by 4. Because as we know, 25% is half of 50. Finding 10% of a number is the same as dividing that number by 10. And finding 1% of a number is the same as dividing that number by 100. We can also now find 5% of a number, which is also a useful percentage, because if we can find 10% of a number, divide by 10, and then there's a second step, divide it by 2, and that will give us 5%. So to find 5% of a number, first find 10% by dividing by 10, then divide whatever your answer is by 2, and that will give you 5%. Right, let's practice using those methods on a number. The number we're working with here is 300. So 50% of 300, well, finding 50% of a number is the same as dividing that number by, that's right, 2. 300 divided by 2. 2's into 3 once, with 1 left over. 2's into 10, 5 times. 2's into 0, 0. 50% of 300 is 150. Now let's find 25% of 300. You'll remember that finding 25% of a number, we can find that by dividing that number by 4. 4's into 3, doesn't go. Move the 3 along. 4's into 30, 7 times, because 7 times 4 is 28. We have 2 left over, so we move that to there. 4's into 20, 5 times. 25% of 300 is 75. Now let's find 10% of 300. To find 10% of a number, we divide that number by 10. 10's into 3 we can't do, so move the 3 along. 10's into 30. 10, 20, 30. There are 3 10's in 30. 10's into 0, doesn't go. 10% of 300 is 30. Lastly, let's find 1% of 300. Now we need to remember, when we find 1% of a number, we're dividing that number by 100. How many 100s in 3? There aren't any. How many 100s in 30? Still none. How many 100s in 300? 100, 200, 300. There are 3 100s in 300. So 1% of 300 is 3. This calculation is asking us to find 51% of 900. How can we use our key percentages to find 51%? Well, when we think about the number 51, we know that 51 is made up of 50 and 1. If we find 50% of a number and 1% of a number and add them together, we will have found 51% of a number. If we look at 60%, we also know that 60 is made up of 50 and 10. If we find 50% of a number and 10% of a number, add them together, we'll have found 60% of a number. What about 36%? Well, 36% or 36 is made up of 25 and 10 and 1. If we find 25% of a number, 10% of a number and 1% of a number, add those three together, we can find 36% of a number. Let's try that now with the number 300. 60% of 300. Well, we know that 60% is 50% plus 10%. 50% of 300 was 150. 10% of 300 was 30. 150 plus 30 is 180. So 60% of 300 is 180. (51% of 300). Well, 50% of 300 was 150, and 1% of 300 was 3. 150 plus 3, 153. So 51% of 300 is 153. 36% of 300. 25% of 300 was 75. 10% of 300 was 30. And 1% of 300 was 3. 75 plus 30 is 105, plus 3 is 108. 36% of 300 is 108. Now it's your turn. Try finding these percentages of 900. 50%, 25%, 10%, 1%, 5%, 51%, 60%, and 36%. You should pause the video now, try and solve them, and then unpause to check your answers. Pause video now. Here are the answers to finding those percentages of 900. How did you do? Keep practicing this method. It's really useful for calculating percentages mentally. Check in for my second video where I'll be showing you a written method for calculating percentages of numbers. Bye for now.